open declaration here before we kick off. I'm a non-nautical sort of bloke. Have been called out in previous videos about the difference between a boat and a ship. Yes, I'm that bad. I will present the facts as best I can tell them. My landlubber summation. I'm rather hoping viewers will give us their penny's worth in the comments. This video will spur into action Southlanders familiar with this incident who may be able to elaborate on what I've presented. The real story may therefore well be, ultimately, in the comment section. Here we go, here we go, here we go. The evidence boils down to the statements and depictions made by two men, the captain and crew member of the fishing trawler called LNI, sailing ex-Bluff. The crew member was stated as being one Mr. W.J. Johnson. I did try and find out who he was, unsuccessfully. The Johnsons, it came to pass, are rather big into commercial fishing, it appears, rather than come up empty-handed. And there were just too many Johnsons for me to do detective work on. Thus, we have to go solely off the testimony of the vessel's captain for this one. And kindly note, by the evening of Saturday the 13th of November 1965, the whole town would have heard about the story at the pub. It wasn't something kept quiet. To start with, the captain was Robert Douglas Hanning, known as Doug. Doug Hanning was, in the truest sense of the term, a man of the sea. Born in Bluff at the bottom of the South Island in 1900, he spent his early days on Stewart Island. When at 5, tragedy struck his family when his father died at sea. His mother was left with him and 4 siblings. Doug was farmed out to another family on Stewart Island. For reasons I never ascertained, he never went to school. Instead, he worked at odd jobs and gainful employment in the local sawmill, then migrated to fishing. Ended up with kids of his own, skippering a series of boats ex-Bluff, one of those being the aforementioned LNI. Highly respected in fishing circles, he earned the mantle as the codman of the South. Strictly old school, Hanning never owned a car, or for that matter, learned to swim. Not the type of chap to engage in pranks, make ungrounded, outlandish claims like he and his crewmate had spotted a half-submerged sub off the north coast of Stewart Island. Let me summarise their testimonies. At 11:30, they were half a mile off Rugged Islands, the northwest point of Stewart Island, when they saw a strange craft come out of the water. Its tapered structure rose about 15 feet above the surface and measured about 5 feet high at the top and 12 feet at the waterline. Then about 30 feet away from it, there was another object, box-shaped, about 10 foot long and 5 foot high. There was no sign of any periscope or railing, and nothing but the tower and box were visible. The water was smooth and the object was in clear view, only about 300 yards away. The object was only 500 yards off Rugged Islands. The men had it in sight for 10 to 11 seconds when suddenly there was a great surging of water, like the tide boiling, and both objects disappeared. Both men were rather startled at the display, and in fact were somewhat frightened by it. They hung round for a few minutes, decided not to investigate, and steamed off. The water at the spot where they had made the sighting was about 30 fathoms deep to the sandy bottom, although the coast near Rugged Islands is rocky and rugged. That depth works out to be 55 metres. 500 yards is about 450 metres. Suffice to say, that's rather close. The box in the front is likely to have been a sonar housing at a rough guess. Another factor to take stock of was the coastal limits in New Zealand at the time were just 3 miles. That later increased to 12. Let's get our bearings here a tick. Immediately the story got to the press, the New Zealand Navy began to run defence. A representative of the Navy turning up in Bluff the week after and telling them to keep stum about the sighting, only it was way too late for that malarkey. Then, when they failed to keep the story quiet, the Navy claimed the crew were mistaken. They obfuscated and fed the public the line Hanning and Johnson had simply misidentified a whale. Give me a break. I can only speak about the competence of Hanning here. This was a seaman who had 40 years' experience in these very same waters. I'm 100% sure he could tell the difference between a large mammal and a large man-made craft. Rather than muddying the waters, the New Zealand Navy made it clear from their actions they knew something was up as well. So why not therefore come out and say so and put minds at rest? When organisations hide things, it leads to all sorts of speculation as to the motives, which inquisitive people with nothing else to do question. People like me. Was it a friend or foe? If you think along the same lines as me, the first thought has to be it's got to be a Russian sub. This is another case of if only it was that easy. Fortunately, we do have a rather basic drawing of what was seen. Art wasn't Hanning's or the person who drew this strongest field, one can tell. As basic as this picture appears, it gives us a great deal of feedback as to the sub's origins in terms of eliminating most of the crop at the time. Away we go then. Starting with our closest ally, Australia, a half-submerged British-built Oberon class submarine like the HMAS Otway on your screens could fit the bill. Only the first of them weren't commissioned till 1967. Therefore, knowing the British had subs meeting the broad description of what was spotted, the likes of the HMS Alliance could well be an outside 25-1 roughie. Given this particular submarine was in Malaysia when they had an up-she-goes with Indonesia that erupted in January 1963 and ended in August 1966. It would have made a really easy explanation why this was hushed up if it was a Russian sub so close to New Zealand shores, not scaring the cattle, that sort of thing. One big problem. Per Wikipedia, no Russian sub in the 50s or 60s had a sonar housing protruding from the hull, a box as it was called. We are rapidly, at this very moment, losing major contenders. That was until I came across the US Navy Ethan Allen Tait submarine, first commissioned in 1962, 5 of which were built. Cast your mind back to that drawing, get a view of the bow of the sister ship, the Thomas Edison. I virtually called it quits after seeing the snug fit, although I stand to be corrected. One thing for sure, it wasn't an unfriendly. What to make of this? More correctly at this stage, what do I make of this? If it was a British Oberon sub, I'm fairly sure the New Zealand Navy would have spilt the beans, since these were an attack subs and only posed a danger to other subs or surface vessels. Given the historic relationship with the British Navy, they wouldn't be doing clandestine, unannounced voyages in New Zealand territorial waters. The US Navy, I'm not so sure on. You see, the Ethan Allens were the first US subs designed to launch Polaris A2 nuclear missiles. The model on your screen accurately calls them at the time the free world's most formidable weapon. I counted 8 tubes, that's 8 by 2. I'm not too sure if the New Zealand public in the mid-60s would have been too chuffed knowing the world's most lethal weapon at the time was barely half a kilometre off the coast of Stewart Island. In what I'm thinking, for a sub of this size, were rather shallow waters, nor would our Navy likely to be happy either, even if they were copied in. And this is now open to you, the viewer and subscriber, to give us some feedback. I personally think Johnson and Hanning were credible witnesses, and go as far as saying they were expert witnesses, Particularly would like to hear from locals familiar with the story who can improve what I've outlined. Stick it on the appropriate Facebook page. Spread the story. Submarine experts as well. A time to rise to the surface. I'm not at the end of this discounting the British sub, by the way. Thanks for getting so far into this, and do revisit the comment section sometime down the track. You never know what may come to light. I will spot you next time. Next up is another mystery sub in New Zealand waters, this time in World War II. Bye for now.